which is known as the 918 incident in China, really marked the start of the brutal occupation of China by Japan's wider war aggressions across Asia. And of course, we know that as we are celebrating or commemorating the 80th anniversary since the end of fascism or the World Anti-Fascist War, we often know that the mainstream Western narratives erases a lot of the history and the contributions and sacrifices on the Asian continent. Of course, we know about the 27 million Soviets who died resisting fascism. But alongside that, there are almost 24 million Chinese people who had been killed resisting Japanese expansionism and fascism, along with millions more across Asia, from Korea to Vietnam, from Cambodia to Laos, from Thailand to Malaysia and the Philippines, and on and on. And according to new research conducted by the Tricontinental Institute, we can see that at least 8 million colonial subjects, especially in Asia, died during the World Anti-Fascist War, which is a staggering 10 times a higher number than the Anglo-American death toll combined. And this is often the people that are erased or forgotten in this Western-dominated World War II narrative. And so for today, as we reflect on this 80 years since the defeat of fascism in 1945, we organized this webinar by Tricontinental Asia together with the Global South Academic Forum to be able to look at this overlooked origin of World War II. And especially centering the experience of Asian peoples and the resistance struggles as essential parts to the global struggle against fascism and imperialism. So today we have four wonderful guests with us. How we'll organize this is to have 10 to 15 minutes each with the four speakers, and then we'll be followed by 30 minutes of question and answer. For those of you who are joining on the webinar and not watching on live stream, you could also use the chat to submit some of your questions or comments, and I'll try to synthesize some of those for our guests today. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, which is a dear friend and comrade of the Tricontinental Institute. Her name is Professor Lu Xinyu. She is a professor of the School of Communication and Journalism and the president of the International Communication Research Institute at East China Normal University in Shanghai. She is as well as the president of the Global South Academic Forum, who is co-hosting this panel today. Her latest book out in English is called Neoliberalism and Neo-Collective Rural China, A Critique and Prospect, which is out at Palgrave. So, Professor Lu, please go ahead.
Many thanks. It's my great pleasure and honor to be here. First, I would like to share two stories. One is about my maternal grandma's family, and then the other is about a Japanese war criminal. The two stories I wish to show something, say something. Actually, 14 days after the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, my mom was born on July 21, 1967, in Xuancheng, Anhui, which was the major economic hub with the 1,000 years history. Just after Shanghai fall on November, the national government designed Shenzhen as a part of the Great Rail Area. So on the morning of November 22 to 24 or 6, 1947, more than 20 Japanese aircraft bombed the city for many, many hours. Most of the city's home and shops were destroyed in that period. According to my auntie's recollection memory, when the Japanese planes was bombing, the adults of my grandmom's family all hid under their beds. She had just snatched my mom, who just 2 months old, in squash clothes from her cradle, where the window pane next to it, which was shattered by a blast, showering the cradle with glass. So which means my mom's almost be bombed to death. When the bombing imposed at noon that day, the whole family, supporting their old and carried the young, where with their little money began their escape as a refugee. They walked 200 kilometers to a little village, which called Zhuwang village in Jingde County, southern Anhui. It was the ancient 1,000 years old village deep in the mountains at the foot of today very famous the Huangshan Range, where and it was my grandfather's grandfather's hometown. Today it was a national 4A level a village where you're welcome to visit my grandmother's hometown. It was very beautiful now, but just during this free time, my grandma's milk dried up. As a result, my mom's health was poor, but survived, fortunately. But countless children, like my mom, however, died under the Japanese bombs and massacres. This is why my mom's name is Zhu Yongping, as the family name is Zhu, the village is Zhu Wangcun. His name is Yongping, which means the eternal peace, which is a kind of the sentiment shared by the countless ordinary people at that time. So this is I wish to tell the story from my mom's name, why they called Yongping, eternal peace. In Zhuang village, my grandmom's family had a neighbor, is a lonely old widow who was always smoking a water pipe. Everyone respected her as called her Grandpa Guada because the water pipe of the sounds of the Squada is Grandpa Guada. Her only son has gone to fight in the war and never come back. Why my mom's passed away, I organized his left the papers. I found an essence she has written in the memory of Grandpa Guada. Guada, we call the Guada Laoye. My grandmother's family story is a reflection of the stories of countless families in China. Every family history in China is connected in one way or another to the national war of resistance. Every inch of China's mountains and rivers holds a story from that war, which constitutes our national memory. This is why this recent military parade invoked such a powerful sense of national emotion. The southern Anhui region was a crucial base for the north walls of anti-Japanese advanced detachment of the Chinese workers and peasants Red Army, the latter the New Force Arms, 新四军. It was also where the southern Anhui incident took place, 皖南事变发生的地方. After the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Mao Zedong delivered a series of speeches arguing that the war of the resistance couldn't be fought by only the army and the government alone. It had to be a war of the whole nation, entire nation. This required political reform within China, a democratic reform of the state and the army that will ensure the unity between the officials and the soldiers and between the military and the people, therefore completing the mobilization of the whole nation. And he said the deepest source of the power of the war lies in the masses. He said the main reason Japan dares to bully us is that the Chinese people are in the unorganized state. Once we overcome this shortcoming, we will place the Japanese aggressions before our hundreds of millions of people who had stand up. The army need to be moved from forced conscription to the political mobilization. The arm had to become one with the people so that the people would see it as their own. Such an army would be invisible. This is one story. Another story is account of World War II from Shanghai television correspondent in Japan. Shanghai television's correspondent who tell the story. An old man whose name was is difficult. It's called the Tushiyoshi, something like that. He graduated from the Tokyo Imperial University in 1938, where he studied philosophy, who especially focused on Kant. He joined the North China Air Army in 1942, entered the battlefield of China. His basic training constitute of facing slapping and various forms of corporal punishment designed to destroy a person's self-esteem. Esteem is correct, right? Self-esteem. Those who couldn't endure that or committed suicide. So it was a process of turning a man into a demon. 3 years later, when he began to train a new recruits himself, he was convinced that a corporal punishment was the best form of education, and he was even brutal to them. During one live fire training experience exercises, they captured 4 Chinese civilians to use them as living targets. One of them, a 16-year-old boy, cried that his mom was waiting for him at home and begged to be released, but he felt no mercy. Instead, he ordered the recruits to charge and Poland. Within when these recruits hesitate and stop before them, he pushed them for them to complete this plot. After Japan surrounded, he was taken by the Soviet army to Siberia, where he spent 5 years to building the railways. In 1950s, he was transferred to the uh, Fushun War Criminal Management Center for 6 years. He said this 6 years was the happiest days of his life. It was there, especially after China's victory in the Korean War, that he began to abandon any wishful thinking and seriously reflection on how he was come to that point. He read a lot of books. He can read books there, and was introduced to the workers of Mao Zedong, such as on new democracy, on practice, and on contradiction. Mao's correct foresight regarding the causes of Chinese Revolution shattered his understanding of the national of Japan's wars of aggression against China. And for that time, the idea of atoning and confession his guilty entered his mind the first time. He read the protracting war, 论持久战, that in order to achieve final victory, it was necessary to implement democracy with the army, between the officials and the soldiers, between armies and the people. It was discussed this issue of Chinese poison of the war, who should be won over through political means. So through this political workers, he began to realize his criminal. Only then did he understand why the poisons of the war at the Fushun Center received such humanitarian treatment. Upon their release, the Chinese authorities not only returned their own belongings, but also give them daily necessary and money to let them buy gifts for their families. After returning to Japan, he helped organize a China Returners License Council, which engaged in the peace and anti-war movement in Japan and defended the peace construction. He said, "The people I killed cannot be resurrected, and there's no end to my atonement. to make the victims' wishes my own, to prevent unjust war, and to pursue a war of eternal peace is the sole purpose for my rest time. He passed away in 2015 at the age of over 100, still at the still busy at the computer with anti-war activities until the very end. The war criminal who had once studied and loved the philosophy of Kant ultimately found hope for peace, for internal peace in Mao Zedong's thought and the war of resistance led by Communist Party of China. So it is in this sense that as we face the rise of new right-wing fascism around the world, the conviction we must draw from the 80th anniversary of the anti-fascism war is that justice will prevail, peace will prevail, and the people will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liu, for that very inspirational, historical as well as personal view on this 80th anniversary of the anti-fascist war. I'd like to take this moment to also highlight that from Tricontinental, together with the Global South Academic Forum that Professor Liu is the president of, we've been monitoring this time when there is an emerging far right of a special type, as we've been calling it, growing militarization and a dangerous new Cold War that's particularly targeting China, but across the Global South. And so this year, together with Tricontinental and the Global South Academic Forum, we are partnering on an annual conference for the Global South, which is focused on this theme, the victory of the world anti-fascist war and the post-war international order, past and future, which will be in November in Shanghai this year. Without delaying too much, I'm going to go to our next speaker, which is Ramon Guillermo, who is the director of the Center for International Studies at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His current research projects are the textual transmission, dissemination, reception, and translation of ideas and ideologies in Southeast Asia, using techniques and approaches from translation studies and digital humanities. He is a proponent of the development of Philippine and Southeast Asian studies as an autonomous academic communication communities. He has served as the faculty regent at the University of the Philippines and is one of the initiators of the Network in Defense of Historical Truth and Academic Freedom. So I'll pass the word to you, Ramon. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me? Is my audio right? All right, thank you for this conversation. I'm looking forward to the other speakers also, but the first one was already so affecting, for me and emotional. So, but I can only talk about tonight in the Philippines, in Manila. I can only talk about some of the events in the Philippines in the 30s, leading up to the Second World War. And I will be referring to some of the conventional histories or the best histories of Philippine radicalism to tell this history. So I'll just begin with the fact that Marxist ideas were already in circulation in the Philippines in the last years of the 19th and the first years of the 20th century after the bloody invasion and stabilization of US colonial rule. So we know that the Philippines was invaded by the United States in the last years of the 19th century. The political slogan, "Workers of the World Unite," from the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, was already certainly well known among the founders of the first Filipino labor union, the Unión Obrera Democrática, in 1902. So our first labor union was in 1902, the Unión Obrera Democrática. And of course, the leaders were well-read individuals who were aware of this very important slogan, "Workers of the World Unite." However, the idea of proletarian internationalism was only understood or grasped very abstractly. One could call this phase, spanning over 2 decades, a period of abstract internationalism. For example, even the most advanced leaders of the labor movement at the time subscribed to the idea that cheaply paid Chinese workers were competing with local Filipino workers and that their immigration should be strictly restricted. There were racist attitudes in the calls to exclude so-called Asiatic labor from the Philippines. The American Federation of Labor, which was an early influence, encouraged anti-Chinese chauvinism in the Filipino labor unions and federations. The resolution of the Chinese question was therefore a pivotal one for the Philippine labor movement. The founding of the Profintern sponsored Pan-Pacific Trade Union Secretariat, the PPTUS, in 1927 in China was a very important development. In communication with the PPTUS and its representatives, the more radical members of the largest Philippine labor federation at the time, in the 1920s, the Congreso Obrero de Filipinas, COF, was able to convince its membership to affiliate with the PPTUS in 1927. So the COF was made up not just of radical labor organizations, it was also made up, but there was a, yeah. So am I still online? Yeah, yeah. So it was also made, it was a very mixed federation, and yet they were able to convince this very large federation to affiliate with the PPTUS in 1927. In the meantime, the Philippine Chinese Laborers Association, the PCLA, with a small membership of 1,500, had been formed by what was probably a clandestine nucleus of Chinese communists in Manila in order to give open support to the Chinese Communist Party after the breakup with the Kuomintang in 1927. So the PCLA in Manila had a communist leadership. So when the COF affiliated with the PPTUS, they took into consideration uh, such declarations of the PPTUS, such as the liberation of oppressed peoples, the struggle for the liberation of oppressed peoples from imperialism, the defense of the Chinese Revolution, the danger of a new imperialist world war, and the struggle against racial and national prejudices. So when the when the COF became affiliate of the PPTUS, the more radical members of the COF, which was led by Crisanto Evangelista, a very important labor leader in the Philippines, they called he and his allies called for admitting the PCLA into the COF, the Philippine Chinese Laborers Association, into the Congreso Obrero de Filipinas. There was stiff opposition to this proposal within the COF. Many of the traditional labor organizations would not want any Chinese members in the Philippine Labor Federation because of the fact that they were, uh, following a certain chauvinist, racist, anti-immigration line. So this proposal from the more radical members of the COF, it could be said, broke the camel's back. So Evangelista and his comrades had to form another radical labor federation, the Katipunan ng Anak Pawis, the organization association of the Sons of the Earth, in 1929, and the PCLA became a member of their new radical federation. They established a Filipino-Chinese United Front and joined in the first Filipino-Chinese joint labor strike in Manila. It was not long after this that the Communist Party of the Philippines, the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, was established on November 7, 1930, with Crisanto Evangelista at its head. So there was a huge development, and the establishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines happened partly because of the question of the membership of Chinese laborers in the labor federation. It is true that Evangelista earlier had some contact with the Indonesian communist and former Comintern operative Tan Malaka during the latter's period of exile in Manila. Yeah, they could have had a lot of conversations about furthering the struggle in the Philippines. But it is likely that the formation of the PKP, or the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, was strongly supported and urged upon the advice of the Comintern by organized elements of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Youth Communist League based in Manila. So when the PKP was founded, there were 3 Chinese in the Central Committee, and there was a Comrade C, a Comrade C, who was a representative from the PCLA. There was also reportedly a nucleus of 16 Chinese workers in Manila who could not join properly because of the language barrier, but they were members of the Chinese Communist Party. So at the first Congress, the PKP elected, along with Stalin and other communist leaders, Xiang Chungfa, one of the early senior leaders of the CCP, as honorary members of its first Congress, of its first presidium. The PKP participated, even with its very limited capabilities early on, in international campaigns such as that against the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. However, the Philippine Communist Party suffered extreme state repression in the 30s. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines on December 8, 1941, the PKP established the Hukbalhap, the Hukbong Bayan Laban sa Hapon, or the People's Army against the Japanese, in 1942. And they armed some 30,000 people and extended their control over many portions of Luzon. The anti-Japanese armed resistance in the Philippines included a group of veteran Chinese communists who had experience serving in the Chinese Red Army. So these veterans from China also helped train and develop the guidebook for armed struggle in the Philippines. So as proletarian internationalism was beginning to assume more concrete forms in the practical struggles of the Philippine communist and labor movement in the 30s, another kind of internationalism would surface and attempt to compete with it. So there was another kind of nationalism. This was the fascist internationalism of Japanese Pan-Asianism, which in 1940 came to be called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was, however, a pseudo-internationalist, ultranationalist, and racist idea. Nevertheless, it drew upon some sources in the more progressive revolutionary Pan-Asianism or Pan-Malayanism, which was a legacy of the 1896 anti-colonial Philippine Revolution against Spain. So in the 1896 anti-colonial struggle of the Philippines, there were ideas of Pan-Asianism already in the late 19th century. Pan-Malayanism, a brotherhood with the Indonesians and Malaysians to struggle against colonialism in Southeast Asia. But some of these ideas were co-opted by the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. An important general of the Philippine Revolution, Artemio Ricarte, spent over 2 decades of exile in Japan after the United States invaded the Philippines and defeated the Philippine Republic. So an important general, after having been caught by the Americans, spent his years of exile in Japan from 1916 to 1942. He was Artemio Ricarte. Another example was Benigno Ramos, leader of the Sacdalista peasant movement, who had led a failed uprising of thousands of peasants in Luzon in 1935. He escaped to Japan and stayed there in exile until 1938. During the Japanese occupation, Ramos came back and led the fascist Makabayang Katipunan ng mga Pilipino, or Patriotic Association of the Filipinos, better known as Makapili, a group formed in the Philippines on December 8, 1944 during World War II to give military aid to the Imperial Japanese Army. General Ricarte returned to the Philippines in 1942 to help support the Japanese, where he died of illness at the age of 78 in 1945. Ricarte, at the very least, could be considered sincere in his belief that some kind of Pan-Asianism was necessary in order to liberate the Philippines and Asia from the USA and other Western colonizers. The tragedy was that the concrete form of this purported Pan-Asianism was the racist, fascist, militarist, ultranationalist Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In summary, and this is just to close, 2 abstract internationalisms began to assume material and more concrete forms in the 30s, coming to the point of clashing during the Second World War with the proletarian internationalism of the Hukbalhap, the People's Army against the Japanese on the one side, and the fascist pseudo-international of the Makapili, the patriotic Filipinos, on the other. In this struggle, fascist pseudo-internationalism lost that in a way, uh, let's say temporarily lost that clash. But one can say that today, various new forms and concretizations of these ideologies in their ebbs and flows are still embedded in the life and death struggles of the Filipino masses. So that's what I want to share tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ramon. I think this is a very important intervention to recall the sort of anti-communism that really was at the core of this World War II history, as well as the communist solidarity internationalism. I mean, we know that especially many of those Western liberal democracy weren't necessarily allies in the anti-fascist struggle in the first moments of the war that erupted way earlier, almost a decade earlier, in Asia than in Europe. In fact, the US and other Western allies supplied so much of Japan's petroleum or scrap metal and really fueled the war machine. It was clear that this hate of communists and the spread of communism was more important than really the spread of fascism across Asia. So I think it's very important that you bring the Philippine experience, but also the internationalism and resistance that crosses across different countries in Asia. So next, I'm going to hand it over to a dear comrade, Dae-Han Song, who is part of the International Strategy Center and part of the No Cold War Collective, as well as an associate of the Korea Policy Institute. Go ahead, Dae-Han.
Thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. All right. Can you see my screen? Yeah? Okay. So today I just wanted to bring the perspective of the Korean Peninsula. But before I do that, I think it's important to note that the story of Japanese imperialism starts, as the speakers have said, much earlier than Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, or even before the 1931 Mukden Falls flag attack, right? Both is prologue and epilogue start and end with Western and U.S. imperialism. And so putting Japanese imperialism into context is not to excuse its horrors and atrocities, but it is to remove the orientalized mist that often accompanies the West portrayal of Japanese fascism, right? Ultimately, Japan's fascism was Japan trying to be like Western imperialists based on this understanding that you are either colonized or you become colonized. Um, Japan's industrialization under the Meiji Restoration, starting in 1868, was a reaction to the intrusion of the West upon the East. Right, the leading civilization in the region, China, had been brought down to its knees through the West's gunboat diplomacy and imposed unequal treaties. When the U.S. Commodore Perry arrived in Japanese waters with U.S. gunboats and demanded that Japan open up its ports, it triggered a set of events that led to the overthrow of Japan's shogunal system and sparked this modernization. And ultimately, to avoid China's fate, Japan would have to join uh, the club of imperialist powers as an equal, right? Sure enough, as Japan expanded, Western powers started renegotiating the unequal treaties, restoring Japan's autonomy over its tariffs and eliminating the extraterritorial rights of foreigners. And just taking a page from the West's imperialist book, Japan imposed unequal treaty upon its neighbors, starting with the 1876 Treaty of Ganghwa to Korea, which basically forced open Korea's ports and gave the Japanese extraterritorial rights. And so the ensuing deteriorating social conditions gave rise to the Tonghak Peasants' Uprising that sought to bring heaven on earth, right, by destroying Korea's caste system and asserting national sovereignty. And to put down the uprising, the Korean government basically joined hands with the intruding Japanese army, setting in motion Japan's eventual annexation of Korea. And after its repression, the surviving members of the Tonghak uprising, they joined the Righteous Army, which continued fighting until 1910. And following the defeat of the First Japanese War, Japan annexed Taiwan and exerted greater control over the Korean Peninsula. After all, to Japan, Taiwan and Korea were simply launching pads to the rest of the continent. And I think Japan's attempts to copy the West were applauded and encouraged, right? The 1905 Taft Katsura Agreement between the US and Japan effectively gave Japan the green light to colonize South Korea in exchange for the US colonizing the Philippines. And of course, the Taft Katsura Agreement was followed by the USA Treaty of 1905 that turned over the authority of the Korean government to shape its own foreign policy to Japan. And from 1910 to 1919, it marked a period of brutal military rule by Japan, right? Like Japanese colonization in Korea was had different stages. And then I think this photo basically speaks 1,000 words, right? This is not the photo of like soldiers or of police officers. This is a photo of a Korean school. And in the middle are two Japanese teachers. They're carrying samurai swords. So you could just imagine how brutal the military dictatorship, colonial rule was by Japan when teachers are carrying samurai swords, right? And during this time, of course, Koreans resisted occupation in various ways. And one of them was through heroic acts against key figures in government, right? This is the 1909 assassination of the Japanese Imperial Prime Minister Hirobumi Ito by An Jung-gun, right? Or the 1932 attempt to kill Emperor Hirohito by Yi Bong-chang, right? And of course, one key moment of nonviolent resistance was inspired by US President Woodrow Wilson's 1918 14 points, right, which included the point on national self-determination. As the Paris Peace Conference was happening at that time, discussing the peace terms for then the World War I and discussing the sovereignty of various nations, Koreans gathered on March 1st, 1919 to declare their nationhood. Yet, rather than recognition, the Western powers blocked the participation of the Korean delegation. Clearly, Wilson's national self-determination did not apply to the non-white races. While the March 1st movement was brutally repressed, it also led to reforms to Japanese colonial rule, which shifted away to a civilian government and towards forced cultural assimilation in a Korean-based bureaucracy. And of course, the harsh repression of the March 1st movement led to Koreans swelling the ranks of the armed resistance struggle that was happening in Manchuria. And during this time, Japan was also industrializing Korea into an appendage to its empire, right? The brutal working conditions and treatment of workers, Korean workers as second-class citizens, sparked various protests and strikes. One of the most famous is the 1929 Wonsan general strike, which spread all across the nation into a broader struggle for national liberation. Furthermore, under the pretext of modernization, the Japanese government implemented various land survey projects, and by the 1930s, the majority of the population had become dispossessed of their land, and 75% of the rural population had become tenant farmers. And of course, when Japan began its all-out mobilization for war in the 1930s, 50 to 60% of the rice produced was taken by Japan. And of course, this sparked continuous struggles by peasants against the Japanese imperial government. With the 1931 Mukden Falls flag operation, Japan starts to undertake full-fledged attempts to colonize Asia, and the war mobilization was particularly brutal on Koreans. From 1939 to 1945, there were 1.05 million Koreans that were taken to coal mines or factories as Japanese forced labor. And perhaps in one of its worst excesses, from 1932 to 1945, hundreds of thousands of Korean women were taken around Asia and turned into sexual slaves for the Japanese Imperial Army. And I think a central protagonist in the epilogue to Japan's imperialism in Korea is the United States. After arbitrarily dividing the Korean peninsula in two, the US military government uh, placed back into power the families that had collaborated with the Japanese. And to this day in South Korea, the descendants of those that collaborated with the Japanese live in privilege, while those of independence fighters live in poverty, right? South Korea remains a society where the progeny of those that sold their country to the Japanese are rewarded, while the progeny of those that sacrifice for independence are punished. And of course, this topsy-turvy world where the villain became the hero and the hero became the villain was a result of U.S. policy that chose to gloss over Japanese colonialism in order to quickly prop it up as a bulwark against communism. And this started with the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, in which the worst victims of Japanese colonialism were effectively excluded, right? South and North Korea, China, and Taiwan, they were not part of this peace negotiation. I think Kishi Nobusuke, who was known as the monster of the Showa era, and he was the one in charge of Mansuchuku that led the brutal industrialization of it. And yet, after the U.S. pivot towards propping up Japan, the CIA basically facilitated the reemergence of those that had led the imperialist government by funding the Liberal Democratic Party. And instead of being tried for war crimes, Nobusuke continued his political career, becoming prime minister of Japan from 1957 to 1960. And sitting on his lap is his grandson, the late Abe Shinzo, who would of course also become prime minister of Japan. Despite being defeated, the US allowed Japan to continue without ever taking responsibility for its war crimes. Even today, Japanese prime ministers visit the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors Class A war criminals during the day commemorating Japan's defeat in World War II. So today, the struggles to hold Japan accountable for its imperialist past continue. For example, rain or shine, the Wednesday protests have been going on for decades. They happen in front of the Japanese embassy by the surviving comfort women that are calling for acknowledgement and justice from the Japanese government. And of course, there's the continuing struggle to get fair compensation for Korean forced labor. Yeah, I think ultimately the struggle to rectify Japan's colonialist legacy is not just about foreign relations, but it's also about rectifying Korean modern society, where again, the villain has become the hero and the hero has become the villain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dae-Han, for that important presentation. I know that here at Tricontinental, we often talk about this battle of ideas that we're engaging in, which of course is also a battle over historical memory. And as you pointed out, there's a battle over when did World War II start, and you've traced it well before Pearl Harbor, well before Poland, and even before the Mukden incident in 1931. In addition to that, it's who won World War II, who made the bulk of the sacrifices, who formed the bulk of the organized resistance against fascism. And as we're seeing across the world, in many, many polls, there are young people, not only in the global north, but elsewhere as well, who really believe that it was the US who contributed the most to winning the World War II history. And it's in this intentional rewriting of history that requires us to revisit, recover, and rectify, as you say, the history and center the Asian people's struggles against fascism, which is something that is still in an unfinished process of rectifying that history. Speaking of history, I'm going to introduce our final panelist here, who probably doesn't need an introduction, but it's Vijay Prashad, who is an Indian historian, journalist, and author of over 40 books. It's probably increased since this bio was written. Vijay is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, the chief correspondent for Globetrotter, and the chief editor of Leftward Books. Go ahead, Vijay.
It's great to be here with Ramon, with Professor Liu, with Dae-Han, and of course with you, Tings. This is a very important subject, and I'm glad we're weighing in into this subject. Of course, as we speak, I'm sitting 100 miles north of the Zionist state of Israel, where a genocide is being conducted against the Palestinians. Live and direct, a war, not even a war, really, a genocide. A war has not such an asymmetrical contest. About 12 years ago, maybe 11 years ago, I visited the Commonwealth Graves Cemetery. That's what it's called, or the Commonwealth War Cemetery, depending how you translate the Arabic, in Gaza. This is a cemetery that's, not far from the center of Gaza, where there are graves that go back to the Great War, World War One, when, in fact, British troops came in from the south, took Gaza City, pivoted around, and then seized Jerusalem from the Ottomans. What's often not said, of course, is that when books talk about Allenby taking Jerusalem, all the troops were Indian, and they made up the bulk of those who were the graves in the Gaza Commonwealth War cemetery in Gaza. Well, it's not just from the First World War, the Great War as it was called, but the Second World War as well. Large number of Indian soldiers fought in the Second World War in North Africa under the command of Edwin Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery, in his battles against Erwin Rommel in Tobruk, in El Alamein, and also in Gaza, where there are graves for Indian soldiers who died in the Second World War. There are, of course, also graves of Indian soldiers who died as peacekeepers after the Nakba of 1948, going all the way out till when the UN peacekeepers were removed from Gaza in 1967. So for that period of almost 20 years, there were Indian soldiers in Gaza, and their graves are there in the Gaza War Cemetery. Tings is right. Dae-Han is right. Professor Liu is right. Ramon is right. We ignore the soldiers, the people, the civilians as well, who were casualties of that second great war, the Second World War. A war, if you watch Hollywood films, appears to be fought by young farm boys from Iowa, played by, Tom Hanks and other people who look just like him. In fact, if you take the war seriously, you'll see soldiers from so-called French West Africa. Osman Sembene's terrific film, Camp at Thiore, captures the plight of West African soldiers who went and fought in that war. My grandfather was there in Italy. Two of my uncles died off the coast of Spain, torpedoed as they went in a ship to go and join the battle in France. Family members fought in the Burma campaign, 1942 to 45, against Japanese militarism in Burma. There were 2.5 million Indian soldiers conscripted to fight World War II. By the way, they were paid much lower salaries than those who came from England and from the white colonies, from South Africa, from Australia, from Canada, and so on, paid much higher rates than the Indian soldiers. We say that 87,000 Indian soldiers died in the war. It's a much reduced number than what I think is the reality. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I want to go over the civilian cost of the war. And I want to make, in fact, two important points about the economics of the war on Southern Asia. The first point is on forced resource extraction. The British diverted food, particularly rice, but also wheat, from the Indian markets to feed soldiers around the world, not just in the campaigns in Southeast Asia or the campaigns in North Africa, but also to feed the United Kingdom. They also shifted cropping patterns in India from food crops to crops essential to the war effort, which included sisal or jute, necessary for sacks and so on, necessary for the war effort. This reduced food consumption in India. There was a denial policy, a forced removal of food, and in areas that the British felt where the Japanese advances were happening very quickly, particularly in Burma, there was a scorched earth policy. They burnt the farms. As a consequence, in Bengal, there was a famine from 1943 to 1944. upwards of 3 to 4 million people died in that famine. War casualties, all of them. You got to add to this the casualties in the Burma campaign from 1942 to 1945. And I would say that as a consequence of really underdeveloped research on Burma, we don't know how many people actually died, how many civilians died of starvation, how many civilians died in the war effort, how many civilians died to the atrocities committed by Japanese militarism, actually not just in Burma, but in Malaya, in Singapore and so on. We just don't have enough evidence, enough writing about what happened during the years 1941, 42, up to 1945. We just don't know enough, and that's a pity. I would actually add to this the entire war against the people of what was called Indochina or later Vietnam, which included later the wars prosecuted by the French and the United States to roll back the gains made by the Vietnamese people against colonialism, first in their fight against Japanese militarism, then against the French trying to resume control of Indochina, and finally against the United States taking over the French in that war of destruction. So the first thing is forced resource extraction and the destruction of agriculture in this region, the transformation of cropping patterns, the creation of enforced starvation. It's a very important point because the impact of this lingers long past 1945. And again, we just don't have a good calculation of what this meant for instance, independent India and Pakistan, where cropping patterns had been disrupted for perhaps at least a generation. Secondly, and again on the economics of it, there was almost an induced inflation produced in British India. You see, what the British were doing, and this is a point again which is often not highlighted. The British were printing money in India. In other words, they were printing sterling in India and exporting it out of India to pay for the war effort. India was paying for the Second World War being conducted by the British Empire. The impact of that inflation used to finance the war lasts long past the end of the war. And in fact, the British dumped independent India and Pakistan with the debt of the war. India carried that debt long past independence. I mean, it is a scandal in 1991 when India goes to Britain and asks for a loan that the British forced the Indian exchequer to airlift gold to the Bank of England before they wrote India a line of credit, when in fact England owes India so much for 300 years of colonialism, but also in particular for the war effort. It wasn't Churchill who wins that war for Britain. It was the Indian people who were paying for it long after the war ended. I just want to give you a statistic to show you the impact of that inflation and the theft of finance from India. Food grain input per capita was 200 kilograms in 1900, in the year 1900, 200 kilograms. At the end of World War II, food grain input had dropped over 30% to 130 kilograms per capita. There was a 30% decline in food grain input. There are different reasons to be included here, but the catastrophic drop between 1940 and 1946 is pretty incredible. Some of this has to do with the high price of goods, but some of it also had to do with the fact that the British played a really nasty game with Indian peasants. They set a procurement price for food grains much lower than what would have been a market price. But then they forced people in India to pay market rates for packaged grain. So they were seeing the raw material being bought by the British Army for almost nothing. And when they went to the shops to buy wheat or rice, they had to pay much higher prices. I mean, this creates an enormous long-term impact in India. And the third point here that I want to make is during the war, obviously, peasant struggles increased, which were it's sometimes independent struggles as well. Peasant struggles increased, people were starving. Sometimes these also had a political character. They were not economic struggles, but also political struggles, such as the Quit India movement of 1942. The British used enormous repression, including aerial bombardment, against Indians in this effort to liberate their country. Now, it's interesting, we don't count the casualties of these aerial bombardments, this crackdown, the tortures of people. We don't count this in the war dead. You know, the 87,000 people counted in the war dead is such a deflated number. If we were able to add everybody, all these dead, the people who died in when the Patri Sarkar was formed in Maharashtra, and how the British attacked it, when the peasants of Bihar liberated their territory from the district magistrates and they faced aerial bombardment in the 1940s, if we added all those casualties up, the numbers would be perhaps more than double. Still much less than the Chinese casualties in World War II. Still infinitely less than the Chinese casualties, much less than the Korean casualties, and so on. But that doesn't matter. They are still high. And I would say higher perhaps than the US war dead in World War II. And that's interesting. That's interesting. Where are the films about our war dead? Where is the memory of our people who participated in defeating fascism? Is it that the West today is so little interested in an anti-fascist struggle because they sacrifice so little to defeat fascism? And is it the reason why it's the Chinese and others who are so interested in anti-fascism because we sacrifice so much to defeat it?
Okay, so Vijay left us with very provocative questions. I think it's a great moment for us to actually open to questions and discussion and debate amongst the panelists. We have about half an hour here. And for those of you who are joining this event now through the live streams, it's the 18th September 1931, remembering the origins of war, fascism, and resistance in Asia. Feel free to type in the chat on both YouTube or Facebook or elsewhere any comments or questions you have for our panelists, and we'll keep an eye on that. But perhaps to start us off, this is a question I think it's open to all our panelists to reflect on. But Vijay can start first. I know that he has to hop off a little bit earlier. So on September 3rd, we saw the big commemorations in China, of course, of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, and as, of course, the World Anti-Fascist War. And there was a massive parade, 10 million military personnel, everyone's seen the images. And amongst, together with Xi Jinping, were 26 foreign leaders, of course, with Russia's President Putin and DPRK's Kim Jong-un, and a very strong Asian presence. We had heads of states from Iran, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Mongolia, Pakistan, Nepal, and several Central Asian countries, just to name a few. And of course, a very clear absence of global North leaders. So I wonder if you, in returning to this history, and in this particular conjuncture, when we're talking about these changes unseen in a century, this reconfiguration of this new world order that was created after the World War II, if you could just reflect on what's the significance of this. Where does Asia, not Pan-Asia, but where does Asia fit into this new configuration? Maybe Vijay can start us off, but we can open up to the other panelists as well.
I mean, it was interesting. I watched the military parade and so on, and was interested in it. And I was interested in the coverage of it as well. In much of the media, and I would say around the world, there was a sense that the military parade that took place in Beijing was an act of somehow war, military display and so on. I understood it the exact opposite. I was interested in the live stream from the parade of the opening, where Xi Jinping went to greet these war veterans and talk to them and so on. And I found the moment of tenderness in that. But what interested me was, you see, if we agree that there are 50 million, maybe more people killed between the Soviet citizens and the Chinese communists and other Chinese patriots who died fighting fascism, if we agree with the number, roughly agree with that, that's a big number. No people that has actually have no people with a memory of something like that wants to go through it again. It seemed to me more like a display saying we don't want this. We can go through it if you insist. But we don't really want this war. We have a living memory of a war like this. We're not interested in it, in fact. But if you insist, we can do it. That's how I read that event. In fact, I would say that most Asian countries have a vivid memory of that war, as I think do most European countries. Why? Because these were battlefields of war. They actually saw the destruction. The strange thing about the United States is that, alone among most major powers, it has not seen a major war on its territory since 1865. The last major war that took place in the United States was its own civil war, and that ended in 1865. It has fought all its wars offshore. And so the people in the United States do not have a tangible experience of war and sacrifice. And I think that's a lesson that needs to be inculcated in people around the world. This kind of arrogance and this sort of flippancy towards war and warfare only comes from a people that have not seen their farms ravaged, their factories destroyed, their people killed, and where it's not just that somebody has gone somewhere to die, so your grandfather or great grandfather went somewhere to die, but that you have to go and visit the battlefields where they died, and that battlefield is right next to your home. That's heavy. That makes you not want to go to war again. Think of the story Professor Liu started with of a mother. I could tell the story again of the loss of my mother's uncles, the twin brothers who were conscripted, taken and killed, torpedoed off the coast of Spain. Their memory is eternal. But imagine what it must have been like for people in Burma who saw everything destroyed.
Thank you, Vijay. Maybe if Dae-Han, you want to reflect on it too, especially with the
Sure.
presence of Kim Jong-un and the significance for Northeast Asia.
Yeah, I think like for a long time, after World War II, basically the system that kind of dominated this area was called the San Francisco system, right? Which is all the bilateral treaties that the United States had with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Japan. And a lot of what the US was trying to do in this region was to prop up Japan again, right? It kind of goes back to the San Francisco Peace Conference and basically glossing over Japanese colonialism. And so I think to some degree it's interesting because what we saw, right, in China, I think in some regards I don't know if one could say it's a counterbalance to that. It's perhaps even like this SF system, even this is kind of like becoming not necessarily challenged, but definitely it's eroding, right? Like with Trump's tariff policies, all these things, they're just eroding a lot of the relationships that were there, like basically Trump is like spitting on every leader's face, and everybody has to come bearing gifts and has to like supplicate for his favor, right? So I think in some regards there is like a shift that is happening, right? Where this kind of like San Francisco system of bilateral treaties that the United States used to kind of like dominate this region. In some regards, I wouldn't say it's the end of it, but there's definitely an erosion in its kind of like in its power of it. And I think perhaps like the military march, all that, and seeing Kim Jong-un, like there, a lot of these things and a lot of these other global South countries, Asian countries being there, I think it kind of like signifies this kind of like shift, this transition that is happening. And of course, I think just from North Korea's presence, um, um, I think as this whole region as the world is becoming much more multipolar, I think it's creating different strategies for North Korea and how to understand kind of like how to navigate this moment, right? If before it was just massively sanctioned and blockaded and basically was like had like very little few choices. Now it actually has many choices, right? Like trade with Russia is like flourishing, right? There's like a lot of back and forth trade where in effect the sanctions they were they were attempting to like destabilize and destroy North Korea are no longer there, right? So I think there's like all these seismic shifts that are happening that in some regards the calculations are also changing. um, so yeah, I think in some regards, the military march and all that, it kind of symbolizes that.
Thank you, Dae-Han. Before opening up to some other questions we're getting in the chat, I wonder if Ramon or Professor Liu, you have something to add on this question?
Okay. Normally, we think China should be the determination of the world peace protection. But before that, we think this is ideal. But after the portrayal, we think we let the world know, yeah, including Chinese people know that China has the capacity and the determination to protect world peace, especially after the 80s, the 80s construction of the China's modernization. This period, we experience the we explore the kind of the realistic way to fulfill the socialism, which means the socialism after World War II, the socialism again become a kind of the hope for the world peace protection. So that's very important for the global south. So this is why I think the global south, the leaders of the global south appeared in the Tiananmen Square, which means a kind of the new world order has been beyond the one the old hegemony, the new reform of the equal and the bilateral profits has appeared.
Thank you, Professor Liu. I mean, I think in President Xi's speech during that parade, I mean, he said some very strong words on that, in that direction. He said that might may rule the moment, but right prevails forever. And at all times, we must commit to the path of peaceful development, stay resolved to safeguard global peace, and work together to build a community for a shared future of humanity. I think it's exactly the point you're making there. We've gotten several questions from participants who are watching our panel today. I'm going to group together 3 and then pass the word around to you all. You can decide how you want to respond. So the first is, does the lack of interest in World War II history in the West show that the West are actively getting ready to take off their mask and go fully fascist in the coming years? And the second question is, can fascism be separated from private ownership in the form of private corporatism that finance state power to align with its own interests? And the third question in this block is, given the trade war launched by Trump 2.0, is there more space for cooperation in Asia today? Maybe I'll first pass the word to Ramon, and then other speakers can chime in.
Where am I on? I can't see myself. Is that all right? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah, but yeah. So the question about fascism being tied with what was the second question again? What was this?
The second question was about the link of private ownership and its linkages to fascism as well.
Yeah, that's exactly my view, that you cannot separate the capitalist system private property and accumulation from fascism. I don't think, of course, there are, let's say, more or less some more feudal forms of fascism, but that's also based on extreme concentration of wealth and power. So the only alternative, I think, to fascism and getting back to fascism is to try to change the social system that we are living under, that we try to project, we try to grasp for and struggle for a new world order that is no longer based on capital accumulation, and that it's based on a peaceful, ecological, egalitarian system of social organization. Otherwise, I think we will just continue going back to fascism and the wars that it engenders.
The floor is open if others would like to respond to any of the questions.
I just wanted to respond to Mo's comment. I think I was just gonna say that I always appreciated when I think there's always like Japanese people that come to Korea and then they visit a lot of these sites where Japanese colonialism happened, and they of course they go there because they see it as a duty to like learn about a lot of the things that the Japanese government is not like teaching the public in Japan. So yeah, I guess I wanted to say I appreciate the comment, as you know, as a lot of Japanese progressive people, I think whenever they're in Korea, that's kind of like the first thing that they talk about, right? They talk about like the connection to Japanese colonialism and basically offering a type of apology that the government is not willing to. And I guess I just wanted to say that, I mean, Japan itself, I think, suffered massively, right? And of course, at Okinawa, like I think Okinawa was basically like a shield that was used by the Japanese Imperial Army to like fight off the U.S. military that was coming through the islands. So I guess just kind of like remembering that as well.
I wish to add that if we back to the roots of the fascism, and it's not difficult to figure out that the 30s economic crisis of America actually is the roots of the fascism of Japan and Germany. So in that way, the capitalism, the crisis, economic crisis, is the roots of the war, especially the World War. So in that way, why the Japanese people, even the working class, all supported the fascism immigration, fascism. So that's the question. So how to, especially in today's, the right wing's populism also arised based on the economic crisis around the world. So in that way, how to figure out the new way to especially for the global south to develop the economic beyond the colonialism. That's very important for today's China and the global south. So China successfully figure out the ways. It's kind of in that way. It's kind of the very important experience, which means through our own peaceful development, we can beyond the war, the imperialism war, to achieve the internal peace of the world, of the people.
I'll pass the word, thank you, Professor Liu, to Vijay, especially if you have any final comments, and then we'll do one more round of questions for Dae-Han, Ramon, and Professor Liu will stay on.
Yes, I mean, my feeling is that there is, of course, an association between the history of something as atrocious as fascism and as wonderful as the anti-fascist struggle. There is an association between that history and how the present moves forward. I mean, take the case of Spain. After the death of General Franco, the fascist dictator, there was a glorification of Franquismo. They built an enormous memorial to him and so on. And then when the tide began to turn in Spain, it became more difficult to continue that memorialization of fascism. We are in a period in Spain now of silence. I visited a Nazi concentration camp for the first time in my life in Buchenwald. And I must say, I was quite surprised by how first, the government in the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, had built this enormous structure of memory in order to teach children upon children. It was obligatory for children in East Germany to visit a camp to learn about fascism and so on. And since the annexation of East Germany by the West, the camp is completely deteriorated. The monument they built to the anti-fascist struggle completely allowed to deteriorate. I mean, it looked like a ruin. It looked like a Roman ruin. It shows you how, with the rise of the, with the right in Germany, not just the Alliance for Deutschland, but for the whole right of Germany, there was a complete disregard for the anti-fascist struggle. And I would say that there was a chilling period in Japan when Shinzo Abe was in power, whose family was involved in the fascist movement in Korea, very much involved there. When Shinzo Abe was in charge, and there was this glorification of the shrine that Dae-Han was talking about. The the commemoration of fascism as a positive force that will teach people the values that are needed for today. If we're going to live in a society where we are not positively commemorating the anti-fascist struggle, I don't know where we go as a civilization forward. So I very much hope that this webinar, some of our publications, the Global South Academic Forum conference in Shanghai in November, I very much hope all of this is going to contribute in some small way to lift up the memory of anti-fascism in order to basically save the guts of our civilization.
Thank you, Vijay. I know you have to run, but we really appreciate your time with us. We can continue on for a final round of questions with the remaining panelists. So here we have a couple of questions. How can Global South alliances design a decolonial program for justice regarding this 1931 to 1945 historical arc, looking at questions of reparations or even access to archives, in order to build a peace-oriented East Asia, Africa, Latin American solidarity, especially when we're looking at this increased Western delegitimization of this history? So that's one question. There is two questions more about fascism. One is to ask if fascism today is stronger than it was during the World War II in Asia, Europe, USA, etc. And then in addition to this is how do we I think, mobilize the working class people on the side of the anti-fascist struggle today, pointing to things like massive anti-immigration protests in London. How do we deal with that working class solidarity? So maybe I'll pass the floor. If whoever wants to speak, please go ahead.
I could take the question. I think it was maybe from an African comrade, like the question about how to decolonize the memory and whatnot. I think the way to decolonize the memory is through exchanges like this, because all the history is there, in each of the countries in the progressive movements. The histories are there, like whether uh they've been written down or whether they've been passed down, like generation to generation through the movement. They're there and they just need to be excavated. And like even the presentation that I did, it's not particularly like the conventional understanding of like what was happening in Korea. It's like a social movement perspective. It's a perspective of people that that see themselves as part of a continuum of this struggle, right? So I think history is understood in it, perhaps uh, in a different manner, I guess, if you are somebody trying to make history. And I think in that regard, like having exchanges like this, I think is always like a really good beginning, as well as just, I guess, writing as much as possible about these histories so that people do have different perspectives.
Absolutely. I think having events like this and your interventions and is building our collective memory and bringing together this different Asian perspectives, which will hopefully be able to publish something from this discussion as well. I wonder if Professor Liu or Ramon, you have something to add on, and you can also add, I think, in responding to these questions, any final comments you might want to have as we're wrapping up this event today. Ramon, I think you're muted.
Maybe I can add something. Right. So maybe this is not exactly an answer to that question, but it's related. Uh, when we talk about the memory of the Second World War in Southeast Asia and Japan's very violent invasion, we always remember our experiences, whereas Japan refuses to teach this history to its youth. It denies what it did in the Second World War, and I think that's a very big um, that plays a big role in why Japan is today is still behaving in this way. That it is not that its youth, that the generations after the Second World War have not learned adequately about their own history, and there's big resistance within Japan itself to teach this history to the Japanese youth. And this plays a role in this kind of continuing problem in Southeast Asian relations with Japan. But let's look at Germany, for example. Germany, uh, as Vijay mentioned earlier, they had, of course, there's an uneven aspect there. But in general, they tried to deal with the Nazi past, tried to discuss and always memorialize the Holocaust every chance that they get, also in schools, to teach the Holocaust. But if you look at that, how they remember the Holocaust and the genocide against the Jews, and you look at what's happening in Gaza and how the Germans are supporting the genocide in Gaza, you would really have to wonder what did they teach the young people in Germany? What are they teaching themselves? If they're memorializing the Holocaust endlessly and repeating it endlessly, and then they participate, they are complicit in the contemporary genocide. What have they really learned? When they say that never again, what never again do they mean? There are of course various explanations behind this, but it's not. But if you look at the difference between Japan and Germany, it's like in relation to the global South, in relation to the third world, in relation to the former colonized countries, they behave in the same way, regardless of the difference in the different way of dealing with their past in the Second World War. So um, that's one thing that we should also take into account when you talk about memorializing and remembering the Second World War. That it doesn't always lead to a progressive and genuine memory, a genuine change in how the people uh, uh, deal with contemporary uh, crises.
Thank you, Ramon. I mean, I think that's a really important point, this refusal, as you're mentioning, around Japan to teach us history, not only to its people, but recognize it on an international stage adequately, is not only a question of Japan's alone, as many of your interventions have already mentioned. You know, it's supported by the Western powers as a direct continuation of the geopolitical divisions that were established in 1951 with the Treaty of San Francisco, which we've talked about, which really established Japan as a permanent military base in this anti-communist bulwark, really. And so when we understand this refusal of Western leaders, say, to commemorate alongside leaders of China or Russia or others in Asia, it's a continuation of this old Cold War logic into this new Cold War logic. And this battle over history is very essential. I want to pass the word to Professor Lu Xinyu if you have any comments and also closing remarks from your end.
On today, how we let the working class all around the world realize that the right-wing social movement, which based on the racism and nationalism, and which is kind of the so-called the new fascism. So they tagged the new fascism as a kind of the protection of their own profits, but the Second World War provided that is the lesson, not the profits. So how to let the working class realize this kind of the lessons from the Second World War, which means the corrected, the historical consciousness to let the people realize that, especially working class realize that. That's very important. That's also the Global South academic forums the obligation to rise the consciousness of the mass, political mass. So this is why we emphasize the Mao Zedong styles, how to mobilize the working class all around the world, especially global south, to realize where their profits based on, not based on the right-wing politicians, just the Trumps, use the people's name to fulfill their own the socialists' profits, not the working class profits. So how to realize this kind of working class consciousness is the major target for all of us. So this is why I think this is the meaning of memory of the anti-fascism, the story, especially for the Japanese people. So how we let the Japanese peoples their own anti-fascism, their own voice for peace to be heard by the world. That's more important. So that's the way to break a kind of the stereotypes way of the interpreted the Second World War from the Cold War's winners. So how to break the Cold War winners historical interpretation? That's the major task for us today.
Thank you, Professor Liu. I'll pass it for Dae-Han for some last comments, and then I'll close us off.
Sure. I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be here, and it was great to be able to speak alongside panelists from different parts of the world that were like deeply impacted by Japanese fascism and Japanese imperialism. I guess there had been a comment about like whether fascism is better, like is worse before or now, and like kind of a comparison. And I think, of course, the fascism that was happening in Japan and Germany. It was like far more consolidated, far more mature. But I think perhaps the question is like, is the fascism that we see today, is it kind of leading in that kind of direction, right? And I think the way to, so what can we do to prevent that from happening? And at least from the Korean perspective, a lot of it has to do with how are you able to engage the imagination and the hopes of the working class here in Korea, right? Um, in South Korea, we're stuck in a system that is basically just switching back and forth between the liberals and the conservatives. And the liberals are are a little bit better than the conservatives, but not by much, not enough to overcome the economic crisis, to overcome the inequality, to overcome like the lack of legitimacy in democracy, the fact that things don't appear to be changing. Like the liberals aren't going to solve this problem, right? So then I think progressives have to figure out a way to mobilize working class people, as well as to offer an alternative, right? An alternative that can excite people, that can spark their imagination. So yeah, I think um, that's basically that's the difficult task that we have in front of us.
Thank you very much, Dae-Han, Ramon, Professor Lu Xinyu, and Vijay. We're wrapping up here in our event today. I think it was a very excellent discussion, recovering historical memory and also bringing that history into the present moment and some of the biggest challenges we're facing. Of course, as the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, we're really created to help stimulate these discussions and debates in this battle of ideas, to bring the people's perspective, the global south perspective, as well as a socialist perspective. And I want to appreciate everyone who was on the webinar for your questions and comments, and those who are watching us on live stream and who'll tune in afterwards. I want to highlight a couple of comments for those who aren't in the webinar, very touching ones from, for example, Nakahara, who was talking about the experience of being one of the Japanese students to visit Beijing and Harbin to learn about Japanese aggression in China and how this impacted their own understanding of this history and also solidarity for the future. We also have another person named Muhemsi that was bringing an African perspective to say that however grim this plight of recorrecting this hegemonic history about fascism, it is a duty for us in the global south to recover this history, this alternative perspective, and that even those who are in the African continent were not directly in the theater of World War II, but millions of people were conscripted to fight for Britain, France, Portugal, etc. And these contributions were also neglected. In addition to many of the comments and questions we're able to address directly. I want to also thank everyone for coming to this event. You can check out our other webinars we've done in the past, for example, on the Asian perspectives on Trump's tariff wars. Please do sign up to our Tricontinental Asia newsletter. Our latest one, co-written by myself and Shiran, is particular about this history and the Asian perspective. We also have publications called the Tricontinental Interventions, Conjunctural Analyses of Asia, as well as a journal called Wenhua Zonghang, a journal on contemporary Chinese thought. So please go to our website to check out all this Asian content that we produce. And maybe to close us off, I'm going to share a short poem, a poem by, excuse my Korean pronunciation, but Yoon Dong-ju, who was a Korean poet born in Northeast China. And a lot of his work inspired the Korea's independence movement against Japanese colonialism and imperialism. And before his death in a Japanese prison, he wrote this: "Until the day I die, I long to have no speck of shame when I gaze up toward heaven. So I have tormented myself, even when the wind stirs and leaves, with a heart that sings the stars. I will love all dying things, and I will walk the way that has been given to me. Tonight, again, the wind brushes the stars." So in that spirit, thank you very much, and hope we can continue this debate and discussion on behalf of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research.